Scheduled time at 14:05. I'd like to now open the continuation of the session on science, technology, and innovation policy. As in the previous the morning session, we have three speakers with 20 minutes each, approximately, with a few time for questions and answers. I'd like to invite now the first speaker, Bruno Brandau Fishel of the University of Campinas School of Applied Sciences to discuss industry-university collaboration from the perspective of technology upgrading. Thank you, Bruno. Please start.
Thank you, Mario. I'd like to give a brief introduction of what I'm going to present. It's strongly related, actually, to the next presentation as well. As you can see, this first presentation is a joint effort between myself, Bruno Fischer, Paola Scheffer, who is sitting right next to me, and Nicolas von Artes, who was here yesterday. This is part of a collaboration we established at the University of Campinas in 2015. You can see the logo of the university, and next to it, the INSISPO logo. It's a project called Innovation Systems, Strategies, and Policy. And we're dealing with some issues, and both of our presentations will deal with the role of universities and university industry linkages within the innovation system in Brazil. So this particular effort, this has turned into an article, was submitted to Technological Forecasting and Social Change recently. It's under review currently. We started working last year because we got acquainted to the literature on technology upgrading, and we thought that giving it a perspective from the relationship or the role that universities may play in not only producing but also diffusing knowledge in emerging countries can be one way, not the only way, but one way to achieve technology upgrading and maybe try to escape from middle income traps. So basically this is the subject I'm going to deal with in this first presentation. So our research goal here is to assess the evolution of universities' embeddedness within the innovation system of an emerging economy, in this case, the Brazilian economy. We're very interested in this issue because not only in Brazil, but in this case in particular, we have a high concentration of researchers in the university systems. In Brazil right now, 80% of researchers are working at universities, not considering research institutes or governmental labs or governmental bodies, just universities. They concentrate 80% of Brazilian researchers. So have huge amount of the human capital of the country in this institution. So it's a possibility, we think, that if we can further integrate these researchers into the innovation system and connect them to companies, that they may be able to strengthen innovative capabilities in firms and other agents. So we're looking here, when we mentioned the evolution, we looked actually at three different periods in time. We looked at 1994, when we didn't have established institutional framework to regulate university industry interactions. Then we moved to 2004, when we had this incipient, or the regulatory framework was at its beginning. And then 2014, when we have a more mature but still maturing regulatory or institutional framework for these relationships. So we consider here Brazil as a country at a development stage in which technological readiness and higher education institutions are among the strategic pillars of the national innovation system of the country. They may play a stronger role, but they are important agents for this country and how it may achieve higher levels of productivity and innovative capabilities. We start from some literature that deals with this role of the universities in innovation systems. We use this to formulate a hypothesis to develop our empirical assessment. So we take universities as potential sources of aggregate industrial competitiveness and countries. The role of the university as suppliers not only of human resources, but also comprehending joint R&D projects and other forms of technology transfer. For instance, as my colleague will present in the next presentation, universities in Brazil are strong, or at least they are relevant players within the entrepreneurial ecosystems of the country. So they produce entrepreneurs, particularly knowledge-intensive entrepreneurs in Brazil. They're strongly concentrated in universities. But we consider also that developing countries, they're in a current state where the participation of universities, and this happens not only in Brazil, possibly happens similarly here in Russia. Universities have a weak participation for innovation. They have a strong participation for science and technology development, but they're not well connected. They are not strongly embedded in innovation production, particularly in firms. So university industry linkages in Brazil and in other developing countries are still, they're incipient relationships. They're not well developed, as we're going to discuss here. Our methodology, we use the descriptive analysis based on social network analysis. We looked only at the 12 most important universities in Brazil. We wanted to look at the 10 most relevant universities in the country, but then we realized we'll leave out two important players in terms of patenting activity in the country. So we established this sample of 12 most preeminent universities in the country for years 1994, 2004, and 2014. So as we're going to show in the graphs later, we wanted to see how it has evolved, the embeddedness of these universities in innovation networks and patenting networks, actually, and particularly relationships with firms. So we assessed, we started from the technology upgrading framework. So we were looking at domestic and international patents, not only domestic, but also these patents that are deposited abroad. We looked at field and technology domains to check for the complexity of the Brazilian knowledge production from these universities and the networks, the relationships established by these universities as per co-patents. So total numbers, we're looking here at 807 patent applications for 3 years combined. We analyzed each of them. We gathered this data from Orbit Intelligence. We used this as the source of data, with the participation for each patent of at least one of the 12 institutions of interest. Of course, some of these patents combine different institutions. So this 12 institutions, often they get involved with other universities within this cohort to develop patents. These are the universities we're analyzing. So what is interesting about this table is to look at the evolution of patent production at these universities from 1994 to 2014. So basically we had no patenting activity in 1994 from these universities. And what I would like to highlight once again here is that these universities didn't have a regulatory institutional framework to foster patents within their academic environment. So patents weren't valued even as indicators of knowledge production at this university. So this may explain why we have so low numbers, or most universities didn't even apply for a patent in 1994. And then we have 2004, and we reach much higher numbers, still very high in absolute terms, but noticeable evolution throughout these 2 decades of analysis. For basically all of the universities have strongly evolved except for the Federal University of São Paulo. Some anecdotal evidence. When we started looking at literature, the role of universities and university industry linkages in Brazil has been praised as an important part of the national education system by many authors who deal with this area of analysis. But mostly these studies, they are related to 2 companies. Probably you've heard of Petrobras, the national oil company, and Embraer, the aircraft manufacturer, which is private now, but originally was part of the government. It was a state company, state-owned company in Brazil. So what we propose here when we look at the broader system, as you're going to see in the empirical analysis, is that these companies, they behave differently for some pretty straightforward reasons. University industry linkages for these cases, they are part of a governmental mission to integrate universities to industry. And it's relatively easier to connect state-owned companies to markets when they're part of the industrial policy, because you just have to establish what's going to be done. You don't have to have a broader market context that actually provides incentives for these companies to get connected to universities. And also, both of these companies, they are, because of their sector of because of their sectoral characteristics, they are strongly internationally oriented. So they compete in international markets, which puts them in a different position from other companies in Brazil. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that even though there are examples of successful university industry linkages in Brazil, they are not good examples of what happens from a system perspective in the country. Some data about patenting activity in Brazil in general, again, low absolute numbers, but what's interesting to notice here is that these 12 universities combined, they respond for almost 9% of the total national and international patenting activity registered from Brazil, including other universities, governmental labs, companies, all of the Brazilian patents. So they have a significant weight on the Brazilian production of patents. In particular, when we consider these numbers, they are higher for these 12 institutions than for cases in Europe when you take the entire academic system into account, or in the United States, for instance, and we're talking about only 12 institutions. So this is another reason why we think it's worth it to analyze how these academic institutions may foster technology upgrading in the country. Some of our findings, so these universities, they present a strongly domestic-oriented focus on patenting. Most of the patents, about 90%, I'd say, 80% of the patents registered by these 12 universities are registered at the Brazilian Patent Office. This is an important axis of analysis from the technology upgrading perspective, because it basically represents the quality of the patents that are being produced by these academic institutions. The co-patenting also is strongly inward-oriented, and most importantly, even domestic patents, they have a low participation of multinational companies. So companies from different countries, they do not engage strongly with knowledge production with Brazilian universities when they are hosted in the country. And also these patents, they do not stand for a complex system of patents, as they are strongly concentrated in two broad technological domains, basically human needs and chemistry and metallurgy. So we don't have a broad scope of patent production. They are basically very well concentrated in a few fields of knowledge. These are the graphs that they are the core of our analysis, right? So we're looking here at 1994, 2004, and 2014. But what I think it's interesting here, so I put there the absence of a regulatory framework, and then incipient regulatory framework, and the current situation. At the end of the 90s, Brazil established some initial attempts to foster university-industry relationships. And in 2004, a law came out, which is called the Innovation Law of 2004, which emulates something close to the Bayh-Dole Act in the United States. It's currently being updated. A new version was proposed in 2016. But it basically sets the rules for university industry linkages in the country. And apparently, even though I would like to remind you that we're talking about small numbers here, but it is pretty noticeable for a 20-year period to see how universities have increased their patent production and how co-patenting also has evolved. Even though I'd like to remind you again, in this 2014 graph, most of the relationships do not involve, I think there's a pointer here, right? Do not involve companies. Out of this, thank you. Out of these 12 universities in Brazil, the one that presents stronger, it's not working, but it's okay. The one that presents stronger relationship with companies is the University of Campinas, which is on the top part of the 2014 graph. Some further data. I'm gonna cut to the most important findings here. So basically, this has been discussed. We analyzed this data. We analyzed these graphs also using other sources of information. For instance, the Brazilian Innovation Survey, which takes the perspective of companies, and we can see that most companies in Brazil do not see the university as a relevant or a strategic partner for innovative activities. And most importantly than that, universities are often seen as partners for training and consultancy activities. So short-term development, not even research and development. And this trend is pretty stagnant throughout different years of the Brazilian Innovation Survey. What this tells us is that universities are not seen by companies as relevant as we think they could be. For a different source of information is the research group directory from Brazilian research groups, which provides a view from the university and how the research groups interact with the industry, not the university as a whole, but research groups in particular. And even though relationships have evolved also throughout the last decade, also the university perceives R&D-oriented collaboration as not among the main reason why they collaborate with companies. This discussion brings us to the importance or to the co-evolution, the potential co-evolution of the role of universities within the Brazilian innovation system and the institutional framework. So we're talking about a short period of time. For instance, empirical analysis shows that the Bayh-Dole Act in the United States took over a decade to start generating results outside of one or other particular cases. So possibly in Brazil, the situation, as we have a strong or it's incipient, but it's a strong institutional background to foster these relationships, and possibly in years to come, it's gonna further embed universities in innovation activities. And to close, one thing that I would like to discuss, that out of these 12 most preeminent universities in Brazil, all of them, 100% are public institutions. And if you are aware of the political and economic situation in Brazil right now, funding for these universities, the budgets are facing strong constraints. So this right now, at least in the short term, might negatively affect how these universities will evolve. I wouldn't say only short term, maybe even medium term. I hope not for the long term. Might negatively affect how these universities interact with industries in Brazil. Thank you very much.
You're right on time, Bruno. Thank you very much for this insight into the evolution of industry-science relations in Brazil for emerging economy. One question we have also in OECD countries is, even though we know there's a correlation between the strength of industry-science relations and economic development, we don't know in which way the causality of this, which direction causality is. Questions? I have one here. Two.
Спасибо большое за очень интересный доклад. Вы, наверное, уже знаете, что в России очень большой интерес к сотрудничеству с Бразилией, и мы, к сожалению, очень редко слушаем такие замечательные доклады бразильских специалистов. Есть вопрос. Вы упомянули две крупнейшие компании Бразилии в области отрасли Петробрас и в области авиации МР. Две компании. Но Бразилия также хорошо известна очень сильной отраслью агробизнес, производство продуктов питания и так далее. Вот я удивлен, неужели нет какой-то компании из агробизнеса, которая бы интенсивно занималась НИОКР, научными исследованиями в своей области, то есть в области агробизнеса? И вторая половина этого вопроса такова. Вы упомянули университет Кампинус, который вы представляете, и то, что он других продвинулся в области сотрудничества с бизнесом, с промышленностью на тему и инноваций. Вот в университете Кампинуса есть ли какие-то кейсы, примеры успешного сотрудничества в области инноваций, НИОКР с бразильскими компаниями из сектора агробизнеса, производства продуктов питания? Спасибо.
Next question, and then you could answer both of them. There was a second question.
Yeah, thank you very much for such a comprehensive presentation. It was really very interesting to listen to you. And I have two questions. The first one is like a minor question. Probably I've missed something in the beginning, but would you please repeat or maybe tell us how you've selected these 12 prominent universities? Have you used any like quantitative indicators to identify them or not? And my second question is about technological orientations of these national leaders among universities. You've said that they're strongly oriented towards two technological domains, and I'm just curious whether it goes in line with the nations, I mean the countries' technological agenda. I mean, if you compare these results to the technological specialization of Brasilia, do you observe the same results or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. I'm going to answer to each in order. So, The first one regarding food production, the relationship between university-industry interactions for agricultural sectors, so agribusiness in Brazil. And this goes together with the second question you asked about the University of Campinas and its relationship with agricultural sectors. So the University of Campinas develops research in this area, but it's not its main strength. What happens with the agribusiness sector in Brazil is that when we look at universities, the most important of this university is the University of São Paulo. They have a school dedicated to agricultural research, but we would have to look to R&D institutes. We would have to look at Embrapa, it's the Brazilian research, agribusiness research enterprise, which belongs to the government. And this is a very strong player within this area in Brazil. And possibly the reason why we don't see, in this case, for the anecdotal evidence in Brazil, any appearance of companies from the agribusiness sector is that the major corporations there developing R&D are multinational companies. And as we see, these multinational companies, they are not strongly involved with, at least with the universities in the country. As per the following questions, how we selected universities. As we were building the graphs and working with patents, this is a very exploratory assessment we've made. We wanted to we used the SciMago ranking of universities, right? So we used their indicator, their classification for the 10 most important institutions. So we chose the number 10. We want to extend this analysis for further investigations. We want to develop econometric models to analyze causality. As Mario mentioned at first, we want to delve deeper into these issues. So for this first assessment, we only wanted to work with 10. But if it did that, then we would leave out 2 universities that have a strong patenting activity for Brazilian standards. So we added 2 more universities for the sample, right? As per your question of the connection between the university industry linkages and patenting activity from these universities and country strengths, actually, there is not a strong connection, right? From the data that we saw, there are other research that deals with knowledge production from universities with publications. Also, we're only looking at patents that shows a stronger relationship between knowledge production and countries' capabilities. But when we look at this data, we don't see that. For instance, because we're not talking about the agricultural system, even though chemistry involves some R&D oriented to the agricultural system. And we have, you probably can't see it from there because the graphs are small, but we have national and multinational companies from the agribusiness sectors involved in this relationships. But we see strong connection between those capabilities and this knowledge production as we assessed here.
Thank you, Bruno, for that very clear explanation. Next speaker, Paola Rüker Scheffer from the University of Campinas at the Institute of Geosciences, also on the issue of university-industry collaboration with a focus on academic entrepreneurship. Paola, it's your first.
Yes. Thanks, Mario. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paola. I am PhD candidate at University of Campinas, Brazil. So it's a pleasure to be here to present our research. Quality comes first, university-industry collaboration as a source of academic entrepreneurship in a developing country. The authors of this research are Professor Bruno Brandau Fisher from University of Campinas, Professor Nicholas Van Ortas from George Washington University, and Professor Sérgio Queiroz from University of Campinas. First of all, I would like to give you some background information about our research. Firstly, we can observe that the weight of industrial funding of academic research has grown in the last decades, highlighting the rising relevance of university-industry collaboration for innovation. In this sense, the overarching goal is to strengthen the capabilities of innovation systems, leveraging the role of universities as generators and disseminators of valuable knowledge, leveraging the role of universities in their regional and national levels. Some of the main conduits for this linkage between universities and industries are related to knowledge transfer activities, as for example, consultancy, R&D projects, and other examples as academic spin-offs. However, we can observe that there are differences among universities in terms of startup generation, despite the trend of universities becoming increasingly entrepreneurial. So, based on this context, the focus of this research was on the generation of new knowledge-intensive ventures as a byproduct of the increased proximity between firms and universities in the Brazilian context. You can see that the lesser attention has been paid to the case of developing countries, which face several constraints in terms of innovation-oriented entrepreneurship, especially because these countries not only have limited levels of human capital, but they also often find it concentrated in universities, as said Bruno. So we intend to answer the following question. To what extent does institutional openness in universities towards university-industry linkage affect the generation of knowledge-intensive spin-offs in the context of larger innovation systems? We propose this question based on the assumption that academic entrepreneurship became a legitimate activity, so extending the reach of university contributions from traditional forms of technology transfer to a direct vector of economic development. And why is university-industry collaboration a conduit for academic knowledge-intensive entrepreneurship? First of all, the universities and academic research can be considered fundamental agents of innovation systems through knowledge transfer and entrepreneurial activity. However, the entrepreneurial university does not only generate spin-offs. Such institutions are also prone to interact with other industrial partners. In this sense, the university linkage facilitates the generation of academic spin-offs through three different reasons. First, the provision of a better understanding of market potential, the development of adequate business models, and the beneficial impacts upon academic researchers' social networks. So we can infer that the university-industry collaboration generate learning and networking externalities within the academic context, planting the seed for increasing entrepreneurial capabilities. Based on these assumptions, we propose two different hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that universities that establish high aggregate levels of university-industry collaboration will be endowed with stronger capabilities in terms of generating knowledge-intensive academic spin-offs. But the meta-analysis of the amount of university-industry collaboration as a conduit of academic knowledge-intensive or knowledge-intensive entrepreneurship may be misleading. The key element in these dynamics, and this is the difference of our research, is the object of the interaction between universities and industry. So the second hypothesis tried to address this specific point, and the hypothesis is that universities that establish university-industry collaboration of higher quality will be endowed with stronger capabilities in terms of generating knowledge-intensive academic spin-offs. We are aware that this poses a difficult for academic knowledge-intensive entrepreneurship in developing countries where university-industry collaboration is fundamentally based on consultancy and training activities, especially in Latin America. So, in this slide, we have a brief description of the method. Our data sample comprehends 126 higher education institutions and research institutes in the state of São Paulo, Brazil, with data available from 2002 to 2010. For every institution, we collect information about research groups that have established cooperative projects with industry, the amount of companies which institution has interacted with, and the content or the quality of the collaboration. For knowledge-intensive entrepreneurship, we collect data about PP program. That is a program of the state. It's a program of the state of São Paulo. Other blocks are added to the models, as for example, knowledge transfer infrastructure, intellectual environment, and entrepreneurial traits. In short, 462 PP projects could be associated with academic entrepreneurs for the period analyzed. And it's important to highlight this is a result of 730 projects. These projects are concentrated within some key institutions in Brazil, and they belong for USP, Unicamp, Unesp, and UFSCar, the most important institutions in this research. This high concentration might be related to localized social influences that academic entrepreneurs exert upon its colleagues, creating an institutional culture that favors entrepreneurial activity. The estimation of econometric models are developed in two-stage structure. The first stage aims at checking for direct connections between key projects and the remaining analytical blocks. This is university-industry relationship, knowledge transfer, intellectual environment, and entrepreneurial traits. And the second stage of the model consists in an indirect form of evaluating predictors of academic knowledge-intensive entrepreneurship through its impacts on universities' patenting behavior, assuming that patents may translate in other forms of technology transfers, such as entrepreneurship, for example. In relation to the results, the overimpression regarding the effects of university openness on university entrepreneurship is mixed. First of all, the density of the relationships, this is the share of research groups that are involved in university-industry collaboration in a given university year is significant in most estimations, but with a negative sign. One can think that is an introductory evidence into the importance of the qualitative aspects present in university-industry collaboration. WINT, which represent the average number of firms involved in university-industry projects, is legalized significant in some models, patenting and entrepreneurship. Nonetheless, there is a lack of robustness in these results. Consequently, we reject the first research hypothesis. And we can conclude that in the context of the state of São Paulo, Brazil, the extent to which universities are involved in university-industry collaboration does not seem to exert positive impacts on academic entrepreneurship and patenting behavior. Here we have the most interesting results, that is regarding the depth or the quality, and we can observe that it performs significant and positive roles in most estimations, econometric models. Based on this, we accept our second research hypothesis, and this means that the quality of university-industry collaborations appears to be related to a stronger academic entrepreneurial activity. It's important to highlight this result because it complements the perception of openness level with an idea of openness quality, and an issue that has been poorly tackled by the literature in this field. Finally, the other variables about knowledge transfer, intellectual environment, especially research eminence of the universities and entrepreneurial traits have an important role in shaping the environment for academic knowledge-intensive entrepreneurship. So we can conclude that the quality of linkage is a stronger predictor of entrepreneurship than the level or quantity of connections. Some data that contextualize the empirical context observed before is the Brazilian Innovation Survey, PINTEC. According to this survey, university-industry collaboration does not seem to be a priority for companies embedding this innovation system or Brazilian innovation system. And this is likely to affect the objectives of collaborations and hence the quality of knowledge exchanges. Moreover, the fact that the depth of university-industry collaboration seems to be behind most of the positive impacts can be a problem for the entrepreneurial environment in a developing country context due to the scarcity of R&D and intensive university-industry interactions. In this slide, you can see the decrease in the percentage of interactions that are R&D oriented over the years analyzed according to PINTEC. And we can also observe the low importance of university-industry collaboration for the firms in the sample. In terms of science and technology policy implications, which is the objective of this conference and of this session, a straightforward outcome of these finds would be towards promoting deeper linkage between companies and the universities. However, this may represent a structural challenge that is more closely connected or related to the lack of R&D orientation in Brazilian firms than a specific problem within the dynamics of university-industry collaboration. In other words, we can say that difficulties to foster higher quality relationships between market and universities in Brazil are likely to be related to more fundamental economic factors of the innovative activity. In this sense, a strong coordination between industrial policy, regulation of the competitive environment and the institutional framework of university-industry collaboration is needed in order to build an environment that are conducive to the deep links that we are discussing in this research. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Paola, for being on time and being very clear. Interesting study here on one important channel of industry, university cooperation, which is existing companies. I see also some implications for the possible work on the climate for science work at HSE, because I think this is related to the climate for industry science relations. We have time for a few questions. I have two. I would take three questions. So I will start with the gentleman in the back, then you, and then you.
Thank you. Again, maybe the question is to this or to previous speaker. The question is about localization program, because Brazil is well known for local content requirement localization program, which basically provide the boost for machinery equipment production, particularly for oil and gas sector, for infrastructure, and such. Particularly like you show Petrobras, which is an example of local content requirement program. So my question is, if this localization requirement have any implication on innovation, engineering, and R&D activity? Thank you.
Yes, yeah. I prefer.
Okay. Next question here, please.
Большое спасибо за второй интересный доклад о науке в Бразилии. Вы в своем докладе выделили не 12 университетов, как прошлый докладчик, а 4 ведущих университета в области НИУ ВШЭ Бразилии. Вы могли бы вот эти 4 университета вот нам вкратце повторно охарактеризовать? Как там обстоят дела с исследованиями с НИУ ВШЭ по направлению агробизнес, сельское хозяйство, производство продуктов питания? То есть, если предыдущий докладчик выделил один университет Сан-Паулу, то среди этих вот 4 университетов какая ситуация? Может быть, некоторые из них, я не знаю, это вопрос, может быть, некоторые из них вообще не ведут исследования в области агробизнеса, или там есть 3 близких лидера. Вот что происходит на эту тему? Скажите, пожалуйста. И введу вопрос о том, как ситуация выглядит сегодня, в настоящий момент. И вторая половина вопроса, какие планы на будущее? То есть правительство или государственные структуры как-то собираются стимулировать исследования на территории Бразилии совместно с университетами, промышленностью в области агробизнеса, или это не является приоритетом бразильского правительства? Спасибо.
Final question on my left.
First of all, congratulations to both Bruno and Paola. Actually, Nick von Orters last year actually talked about some of the research he was doing with you, so it is good to see the authors, main authors also. My question is to Paola, actually. You were talking about FinTech, the Brazilian Innovation Survey, and I'm not familiar with it, but do you collaborate with other countries? Is it similar to the innovation surveys of which countries, and where do you do collaboration? Because it could be an interesting example for other places. Thank you.
I think I'm going to start because I think the first question was related to both of our papers, right? And the second, I think I can help responding as well. The first one you mentioned, the issue of localization, you mean the necessity of local content for the production. I totally agree. I think that's a strong barrier for R&D activity in Brazil. When we mention the market conditions for the incentives for companies to establish not only R&D, but innovation activity in general. In Brazil, they're very low. The incentives are very low. And one of the issues is that we have a really closed market for international trade. If you look at all the countries in World Bank databases, Brazil is among the bottom 2 in terms of trade openness. It's in front of, I can't remember which other country, but it's second to last. So we have a very closed market, and I'm sure when I've ran econometric estimations, not only on these issues, but on the Brazilian national education system, and it comes out that is one important barrier for innovation activity in the country, and certainly for setting the incentives for companies to engage with collaboration with academic institutions, right? I don't know if that responds to your question. Yeah, the issue of the local content, I think it's one form of barrier even though the idea might be to develop the industrial capabilities in Brazil, what happens is that you establish an industry that is protected from competition from abroad. That's what's been going on in the country. So you set the regulation to produce locally, but you don't set incentives to produce better. So you're producing in Brazil, but you're not advancing in terms of embodied knowledge and products.
Thank you for the questions. I will start for the last question that is easier. Pintech is based on
Community Innovation Survey.
Community Innovation Survey, yes. The questions are very similar, the structure also too. And about the agribusiness, all universities, the 4 most important universities are public and federal universities, and
there's one thing, a contextual issue on your question. Thank you all for your questions, right? First, is that we're looking at different things here. The first one, we're looking at patenting activity. And the second one, we're looking at entrepreneurial activity. So how many new firms, knowledge-intensive firms, are coming from these universities. That's why the number of institutions is different from the first analysis than to the second. I think that's one important issue. So now you can go on.
It's difficult.
Out of those universities, on the 4, it's the University of Campinas, the University of São Paulo, the State University of São Paulo, which is a different institution from the University of São Paulo. The state of São Paulo has 3 state universities, right? University of Campinas, University of São Paulo, and the State University of São Paulo. The 3 of them are in those 4 that produce more knowledge-intensive new firms. And the 4th one is a federal university, which is the University of São Carlos. All of them have been performing R&D in agricultural sciences, right? Some of them, the University of São Paulo, for instance, and the University of São Carlos, they are strongly engaged in this research together with industries. University of Campinas, slightly less in agricultural sciences. But they're very diversified institutions, right? They're large institutions, especially the University of São Paulo and the State University of São Paulo, which has it's a little short on 30 campuses on the state. They have a very diversified profile. Probably the most focused of these universities would the University of Campinas, but still is a university that has several orientations. The main issue here that I think...
Maybe we could...
okay.
Yes. Sorry. A lot of interest in Brazil. I encourage you to see Bruno and Paola at the coffee break and for further questions. I'd like to ask Marco Vivarelli from From Milan, the Institute of Economic Policy at the Catholic University on is R&D good for employment? We know nowadays that a lot of concerns about artificial intelligence, research and innovation destroying future jobs. So let's see what we can learn. Marco, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the organizer to invite me here. It's the second time that I'm at the Irish School of Economics. It's really a pleasure for me. The idea today is to give you just a flavor of the coordinates in economics, both theoretically and empirically, about the possible link in between technology and employment. This conference is about foresight, and the picture here is an example of foresight. Is a painting by Fernand Léger 100 years ago, 1917, quite important date for this country. And Fernand Léger is actually representing robots playing cards. And that's quite interesting because playing cards is not a repetitive and automatable kind of a job. It's a highly cognitive and skilled kind of activities. And the challenge today is exactly this one. As was mentioned by the chairman, the application of AI and robots to cognitive activity is the topic today. In a way, scaring from some concern, and the self-driving car is the usual example. That makes both in the policymakers, in the debate, and the academic research, again, the attention to the possibility of technological employment raising up. This type of topic is really cyclical. When things are going well and technology is relatively stable, the attention about the knowledge and employment relationships is going down. When, as nowadays, we are in a period of crisis from an economic point of view and new technologies are actually diffusing, then again the debate come up. Brian Johnson and McAfee, in their book, Race Against the Machine, they actually support the view that the real problem today is not the crisis, the financial crisis, or the public debt crisis, but the great restructuring in terms of new technology and possible impact on jobs and skills. The most quoted forecasting scenario is one related to the paper by Frey and Osborne, two sociological guys in Oxford. The working paper is going around since 2013. That's been recently published this year in Technological Forecasting and Social Change. It's really quoted. And they predicted that about 50% of tasks and jobs are at risk, including highly cognitive tasks in sectors like accountancy, legal works, medicine, diagnostics, translation, technical writing, and so on and so forth. There are other kind of scenario. The OECD came out recently with a much more optimistic scenario where on average the risks are about 6%, with differences across countries and across sectors. Anyway, which kind of theory and which kind of empirical framework can be shamed by the economist? Actually, the debate started with the beginning of the economics discipline, because there were, on the one hand, people like David Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say, Karl Marx shaping the economic theory. On the other hand, the reality. And the reality, as you may remember from what we studied at the high school, was the strong reaction of workers against machineries. So now we are talking about Industry 4.0, but if we go back to the first industrial revolution, the reaction was this one: destroy machinery. Ned Land was actually eating the lattice in the Lancashire, destroying textile machinery. Captain Swing in the south of England was leading workers, agriculture workers, destroying thrashing machinery. So this was the reply by the workers, and the big scandal came out with Ricardo at that time. David Ricardo was also a policymaker, was actually a member of parliament. And he added a chapter in his Principle of Economics, concluding that this scaring opinion by the working class was actually possibly consistent with the economic theory. And this was really a scandal, because most of his colleagues, they were quite optimistic about the final impact of technology on employment. We will see in a while that David Ricardo was optimistic as well. This kind of quotation has been in a way overemphasized. The debate was quite intense. Now we don't have time to go through the different lines of reasoning by the classical economists. This guy is Jean-Baptiste Say, this is Karl Marx. Anyway, this kind of classical theory was translated by contemporaneous neoclassical economists. This is John Hicks. And you can find exactly the same kind of framework in a recent theoretical paper by the economists. And now we'll try in a nutshell to describe the logic of the economics approach to the issue. That is important, even for policymakers, even for forecasting. So what we have a process innovation as a first step that by definition is actually an increase in the production function, is the possibility to produce the same amount of goods with less inputs, less capital and less labor. So the very first effect is by definition labor saving. But what the economists try to address is that actually there are so-called compensation mechanisms that can counterbalance, or more than counterbalance, the initial displacing effect. The first one is about a new machine. What do you lose in terms of employment downstreams because of the substitution of new machinery, robots, artificial intelligence, substitution of workers, you can gain in the production of capital goods. That was the first way our economists try to figure out the possibility to go back to a steady state full employment equilibrium. The second kind of mechanism, much more powerful and much more used by recent theorizing, is the idea that in perfect competition, if you have perfect competition, and so you have a very high price elasticity, innovation meaning decreasing in cost. If you have decreasing cost, in average cost, you have decreasing prices, an increase in demand, an increase in production, and finally an increase, and eventually an increase in employment. So this is a mechanism that we can define via decreasing prices that can compensate the initial job losses. What about being in a situation that is in the reality the most common situation where you don't have perfect competition hypothesis? And so part of the gains are not translated to decreasing prices. Here again, no problem from an economist point of view. And that was actually a mechanism put forward by David Ricardo that was not pessimistic at all. That quotation was about an exception. In the normal times, Ricardo was saying that innovation is implemented because of profit motivation and maximization of profits, as we also recalled this morning in the John Linton presentation. The motivation in a kind of linear model by innovative firms is just profitability. So if innovation is increasing profitability, no problem. Profitability will be transferred in increasing investments. Investment means an increasing in demand, in supply and demand, and this again is leading to increasing production, increasing employment. Finally, if we still have some kind of technological employment, the labor market can actually work. And in the labor market, increasing unemployment means decreasing real wages, and decreasing real wages along the demand for labor should push an increase in the demand for labor, an increase in employment. That's the mainstream view that is quite optimistic at the end of the day. And most of classical, neoclassical, and contemporaneous colleagues, they still believe in this kind of mechanism. One of my mentors, Chris Freeman, was totally skeptical about this kind of optimistic and classical view, where technological change may indeed result in some temporary unemployment. With efficiently operating labor capital in good markets, there is no basic economic problem arising from the introduction of new technology. That was the belief of the economists. And Chris and other people at SPRU, where I did my PhD 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago, they were actually critical and skeptical about the different compensation mechanisms. If we put together a kind of evolutionary approach, taking into account the real content of innovation with a Keynesian view, and this is John Maynard Keynes, all these mechanisms, they have some problems, serious problems. First of all, new machinery. Well, first of all, if you want to have an increase in profitability, you have to save more inputs in the process of implementing a new machinery than the inputs that you need upstreams. Otherwise, there is no profitability at the aggregate level. So at best, upstreams you can compensate just a portion of the job losses. On top of that, when you talk about process innovation is also affecting capital goods sectors. So it's a kind of chicken and egg problem. In the capital goods sectors, upstreams, you have the same problem of a substitution of labor with new machinery. Most important, most of new technology, what we call embodied technological change, implementing labor-saving innovation, is not through additional machinery. It's just with scrapping, substitution of old machinery with newer ones. So when you just make a substitution of an electromechanical assembly line with a fully digital assembly line, you're just making a new machinery and scrapping the oldest one. So you don't have any kind of compensation in the capital goods sectors. The mechanism via decreasing prices. Here again, there are strong critical points. First of all, if we look at demand, the very first effect is a decrease in demand. If you have as a first impact of process innovation job losses, those workers that are also consumers are not actually spending anymore. They don't have any kind of purchasing power. So what you have at the very beginning is a decrease in demand. Later, you can have an increase in demand due to decreasing prices. But first of all, you have a collapse in the aggregate demand, in the consumer demand. Second, we don't have the point, but this is the second point, the demand elasticity is important. It could be the case that demand elasticity is less than 1. So even if you have demand increase, price decrease and demand increase, depends on these crucial parameters. Finally, especially when you are talking to business kind of demand, decreasing prices are not enough to increase in demand. This is the case today. Investments, they don't go up just because interest rates are going down or because the price of machinery is going down. Investments are actually related to expectation. And so if expectations are gloomy, even decreasing prices are not enough to jump to an increasing investment demand. This is another critiques can be applied also to the third mechanism, the one on the bottom left. Again, we are not assured that increasing profits are translated in increasing investments. After Keynes, this is not doable anymore. Increasing profitability is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for an increase in investments. Again, expectation matters, and so on and so forth. Finally, investment is again the way how embodied technological change is implemented in the system. So on the one hand, you have an expansionary effect, a labor creating effect. On the other hand, you still have the labor saving effect. So you don't know which is prevailing. Last but not least, on the right bottom, the mechanism decreasing wages is again debatable, because decreasing wages means decreasing demand. Decreasing wages is not a sufficient condition to reverse in technology and to go back to labor-saving technology. If you believe, as we believe, in part dependence, a kind of change in the relative prices of labor and capital is not enough to go back. So at the end of the day, if we assume a more critical view of the economic theory has not a clear answer to the final question about the relationship between technology and employment. Process innovation are labor saving, compensation mechanisms are at work. The final impact, the rate of compensation, whether it's 50%, 100%, or more than 100%, is an open question. It depends on the market structure, on the key parameter, and so on. If we have to focus on possible job creation effect, we have to shift the attention from process to product innovation. Product innovation are definitely labor creating, are job creation, have a job creation effect. Why? Because new products, they actually have a new, I started later because of that. I started at 3:05. Product innovation are labor intensive. There is a substitution effect, because product innovation can displace all the products, but generally the labor job creation effect is dominating. As I said, the theory today is more or less based on the same kind of approach and the same kind of parameters, and sometimes the same kind of ex-ante assumption. So in some of these theoretical mainstream models, you have this final outcome in terms of full employment that is fully based on some critical assumptions that are actually debatable. Recently, starting from the 90s, attention correctly shifted to the empirical side. And you can approach the matter at the macro level, as I started with my book in 1995. I started with a macro approach with a lot of cons and pros. The good point of a macro approach is that you can take into account the overall analysis that I just summarized. The cons are that you don't have a grasp in terms of measurement of technology. You have to do heroic assumption, like R&D is my proxy of the aggregate level of technology in a country. You hardly distinguish in between product and product innovation. It's complicated. And in addition, you have to rely on Keynesian kind of models that are a little out of fashion today. If you go down to the meso-industrial sectoral level and the macro level, you gain in terms of data, in terms of grasp of technology, but you lose something in terms of the overall picture. Empirically, the main structure goes back to Schumpeter as represented in the photo. And you still have to distinguish in between product and process innovation. Even before, if you talk about innovation input, that is on the left block of the slides, you have to take into account that empirically, as the Community Innovation Service all around the Europe and the world tell us, at the business level, at the firm micro level, R&D is just about 50% of the innovation efforts. As the half of innovation efforts is through embodied technological change, new machinery, including robots and AI application. And that's important to be taken into account and is often neglected by economists. R&D is more related to product innovation, is more related to job creation. Of course, embodied technological change is more related to process innovation and job destruction. So most of the studies, including some of mine, are focusing on R&D, and this means an ex-ante optimistic bias in a way. Of course, taking into account about technological change is much more complicated in terms of data, but the longitudinal database, like the Spanish Pintec, can be a good example, and we use in some recent studies because they have a question about the total expenditure, innovation expenditure by firms in new machinery and equipments. That is exactly a good quantitative proxy of embodied technological change. If we go to the literature, including some papers of mine, is generally optimistic. So what you find in the literature is a dominant positive coefficient in terms of these are all econometric studies, all of them longitudinal and with panel analysis, starting with the John Varinen papers on the Journal of Library Economics and going down to most recent papers. So they are good in terms of taking into account endogeneity and observable effects at the firm level and so on and so forth. And most of them, they come out with a positive effect. There are some qualifications that I will try to summarize in 3 minutes. First of all, most of the studies, including some of mine, say that R&D as such is labor-friendly. So a kind of R&D subsidy or the R&D European Union policy of increasing the R&D GDP ratio is good for employment. It's good for employment. Anyway, it means that most of the job creation is just related to product innovation. So what we need is a targeted industrial policy. Actually try to foster, to support thinking between R&D expenditure and product innovation. On the other hand, price and income compensation mechanisms maybe are not fully effective, but they are important. So paradoxically, when we talk about competition policy, that seems something like just for antitrust and consumer welfare kind of gains, competition policy is also good in terms of foiling in between innovation and employment, because flexible prices are good in terms of fostering the compensation mechanism via decreasing prices. So from this point of view, industrial innovation policy could be quite important. The other point is that what you find in terms of results is that this product innovation, job creation is highly concentrated in high-tech sectors and high-tech services. It's not spread around all the sectors. And these are the, if you like, the more negative or controversial aspects of the empirical stuff that I did and other colleagues did. First of all, the job creation effect is very small. The elasticity you find is generally less than 1%. That means that if you double the R&D investments, you can have some job creation effect in terms of 0.5, 0.7%. So it's very small. Is limited to product innovation and high-tech sectors. So from this point of view, again, structural, targeted policies are needed. On the other hand, process innovation, particularly in low and medium tech sectors, can have a technological employment impact. So this is particularly worrying for some countries, like for instance Italy, that is specialized in medium-low tech and SMEs. From this point of view, you have also to work on labor and education training policy in order to compensate possible displacing of low-skill employment. Together with this kind of targeted innovation policy, industrial and competition policy are important in order to make the compensation mechanisms I just sketch more effective. But at the end of the day, you have losers. You can have losers. Maybe not 50% forecasted by Frey and Osborne, but you have surely losers. The less skills, the employment in the low-tech sectors, and countries specialize in low and medium techs and SMEs. So from this point of view, safety nets together with education training policy should be fostered and enforced. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Vivarielli. Any questions on this very exciting but divisive area, employment and R&D? Yes.
Excellent presentation. We discussed some of these issues briefly yesterday, but my point is that robotics and artificial intelligence are growing exponentially. So there is going to be much more than what has happened in the last 10 years. So using as a reference what has happened, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, has nothing to do really what we will see probably in 10 or 20 years in the future, because we are experiencing exponential changes. Technology is accelerating very fast, and we will see more and more. So I don't know if this is valid for the future, really.
Thank you. That's an important question. What is said, for instance, by Brian Johnston and McAfee, that we are in a way inside a kind of structural break. A structural break that is actually making the new technological wave in terms of AI and robotics completely heterogeneous, faster and different from the previous industrial revolution. Could be the case. That was also said when the ICT were spreading around. Every time that we have a new paradigm, the fear is that is something completely different, and the pace of the change is expected to be faster. I don't know. There are some people more pessimistic that actually stress the point that this should be kind of a substitution effect. Some others that actually underline the complementary effect. So for instance, the idea that radiologists should be crowded out by the new artificial intelligence screening is supported by some experts. Some others say no, radiologists are still important because the new machinery and the new robots are complementary to human beings in, for instance, diagnosis. My personal attitude is that this kind of revolution is really different. So from this point of view, I agree with you. On the other hand, the overall theoretical debate in terms of price and income compensation, substitution effects, and key parameters are, I think, still on the table in terms of affecting and predicting what is going to be in the next year. Probably the point is that if we estimate price and income elasticity today, we have to update our estimates instead of every 5 years. In this particular climate, every 2 or every year. So it's a problem, it's an empirical problem in terms of updating forecasting more frequently. But in terms of what we can expect in terms of economic mechanism and impact, the framework, I think, is still valid, especially the Schumpeterian one.
Thank you very much. I think we're at our coffee break. I'd like to now thank all three speakers and then welcome you back. It is now 2:31, so we're going to have to eat into our coffee break. So that the other speakers do not get shortchanged, we should be back at 3:30. So we'll have a shorter coffee break. Sorry.
3:40, you mean?
Sorry. Yes. No, we should be back at 4. Yeah.
It's an acceleration.